Hey, I'm a 28-year-old guy working as a software developer. Recently, I moved back in with my parents to save some money. I'd been living on my own for about 6 years, but with rent prices skyrocketing lately, it's become almost impossible to save anything for a down payment on a house. My goal was simple: cut down on expenses, put some money aside, and get out of their place within a year. Spoiler alert, things didn't quite go as planned. Before I moved back, we had what seemed like a clear and straightforward conversation. I told my parents that I'd help out with groceries, utilities, and anything else they needed. In return, I expected a bit of space to do my thing. They were all smiles and reassurances, saying it would be like a family reunion and that they were happy to have me back. My mom even joked about how nice it would be to have another pair of hands around the house. At the time, it sounded like a win-win. The first few days were smooth. My parents were thrilled to have me back, constantly checking if I needed anything and even cooking meals for me. I appreciated the home-cooked food after years of takeout and microwave dinners. It felt good, like a little nostalgia trip. We had a few family dinners, caught up on each other's lives, and even watched some old movies together. But I should have known that the honeymoon phase wouldn't last. 2 weeks in, things took a weird turn. My parents suddenly started talking about how it wasn't safe to be out late anymore. They decided that it would be best if I was home by 11 p.m. every night. They tried to frame it as concern for my safety, but I couldn't help feeling like a teenager all over again. I thought it was a bit strange since I'm a grown man, but I didn't want to rock the boat just yet, so I agreed. Besides, I figured it would be temporary. Not long after that, more rules started piling up. My parents began assigning me daily chores, taking out the trash, vacuuming, washing dishes, you name it. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mind helping out. But this was getting excessive, especially considering I was already chipping in for the groceries and utilities. I had a full-time remote job, and I needed to focus on that during the day. But every time I'd get into a workflow, my mom would knock on the door asking if I could do this or that around the house. It was like I couldn't get a moment's peace. Then came the grocery situation. Initially, I thought we'd just take turns shopping or something. Instead, they'd do the shopping without asking what I wanted, and suddenly the pantry was filled with food I didn't eat, like their favorite cereals and snacks. If I wanted something different, I had to buy it myself. I brought it up once, but they brushed it off, saying they weren't used to my city diet. It seemed like a small thing, but it started adding up. Little by little, I realized I was spending more money than I thought I'd be saving by living with them. The internet situation was the next hit. Out of nowhere, they decided to start turning off the Wi-Fi at 10 p.m. every night. Apparently, screen time should be limited, even though I'm 28 and need to work late sometimes. When I tried to explain that my job occasionally required me to be online late, they insisted it was unhealthy to be staring at screens all night. It didn't matter that I was working, I guess that part didn't fit their vision of family time. Speaking of family time, it became mandatory. My parents decided we should have weekly family dinners and game nights. I tried to argue that my work schedule could be unpredictable, but that didn't seem to matter. If I said I had a deadline, they'd guilt trip me, saying things like, "We just want to spend time together. Why is that too much to ask?" I ended up showing up to these dinners and game nights, even when I had work piling up. The dating conversation was probably the most awkward part. At one point, I mentioned that I'd like to start dating again. My parents were all ears, until they heard that I didn't plan on introducing them to anyone, until it got serious. That didn't fly with them. They said they wanted to meet anyone I might go out with, just to know their intentions. Suddenly, I was dreading bringing up anything personal around them. It felt like I was walking on eggshells. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I started sneaking out of the house just to avoid the curfew and get some time to myself. Sometimes I'd sit in my car using a hotspot just to work in peace. But of course, that couldn't last long. One night, they caught me sneaking back in, and it turned into a massive argument. They accused me of breaking their trust, and I couldn't believe that I was having a curfew-related fight at 28 years old. I tried to explain that their rules were making it impossible for me to function, but it only made things worse. Our house, our rules, they'd say, and I had no choice but to follow along. Our work started suffering too. My parents would randomly barge into my room during Zoom calls, offering snacks or reminding me to take breaks. It threw off my focus and led to some pretty awkward moments with my coworkers. I even had to explain to my manager why my productivity was slipping. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd moved back in to save money, but now I was spending extra on coffee shops and co-working spaces just to get some work done outside the house. At this point, I felt like I was trapped in a situation I couldn't win. Instead of saving for a house, I was barely keeping up with my expenses, thanks to constantly needing to escape the house for some sanity. That's when I turned to Reddit for advice, hoping someone out there might have some ideas on how to survive living with my parents without completely losing my mind. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out struggle. Update 1. After weeks of rules piling up, I finally decided to sit down with my parents. I needed to clear the air about a few things: the 11 p.m. curfew, the constant interruptions during work, and the feeling that my privacy didn't seem to matter to them. I tried to keep it as respectful as possible, reminding them that I'm 28 years old, working full-time, and only moved back in to save money. But before I could even get through half of what I wanted to say, they cut me off with, "Our house, our rules." They didn't see why anything needed to change. Instead of loosening up, they went the opposite direction. My parents decided that since I was acting like a teenager, maybe I needed a stricter curfew, 10:30 p.m. instead of 11. They said it was for my own good, that I needed structure. I didn't know what to say to that, so I kept my mouth shut. But inside, I knew that things were just going to keep getting worse. A few days later, I noticed that something was different with the Wi-Fi. It felt slower, and I couldn't access certain sites. Turns out they'd installed a new app to monitor and limit my internet usage, like I was a kid again. When I confronted them about it, they said it was for the well-being of everyone in the house, to encourage less screen time. It was another reminder that they didn't see me as an adult, just someone living under their roof. My work started taking a hit from all of this. I'd missed deadlines, and my manager called me out in a meeting about my recent performance drop. It was embarrassing, especially since I had always been the reliable one. But what could I do? Every time I tried to get into the zone, one of my parents would knock on my door with some random request, or I'd get kicked off the internet because it hit some new nightly limit. I started feeling like I was living in a cage. Then, things got even more awkward. My parents decided that they should be able to come into my room whenever they needed. Privacy, in their eyes, was just a courtesy, not something I should expect. They'd barge in while I was on Zoom calls, and I'd have to scramble to mute my mic or turn off my camera. There were times when they walked in on a client meeting, bringing me a snack or checking up on me. I don't know if my colleagues noticed, but I felt humiliated every time it happened. One evening, after yet another argument over house rules, my parents dropped a bombshell. If I didn't like how things were going, I could find somewhere else to live. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it became clear that they thought this ultimatum would scare me into submission. I pretended to consider their point, but inside, I was already starting to make plans. Around this time, a close friend of mine caught wind of what was happening and offered me a place to crash if things got too bad. I was grateful, but their space was small, and I didn't want to be a burden. Still, it felt like a lifeline, a way out if I really needed it. And that's when I decided to start putting money away in a separate savings account, one my parents wouldn't know about. If I kept at it, maybe I could leave sooner than I'd originally planned. I thought I was being careful, but one morning I made a huge mistake. I left my email open on the family computer, and my dad happened to see an email from my bank about my new account. They confronted me, demanding to know why I was hiding money from them. I tried to brush it off, saying that it was just for better budgeting, but they saw right through it. Their faces went red, and before I knew it, we were in the middle of the biggest blow-up yet. They accused me of being dishonest, of acting like I didn't trust them. I fired back, saying that they were treating me like a child and that it was impossible to save money or focus on work with all the restrictions. Voices were raised, things got said that couldn't be taken back, and I ended up storming out of the house just to cool off. The next day, I came back, expecting another round of the same fight, but my parents were surprisingly calm. They tried to smooth things over, offering to relax some of the rules, like letting me keep my own hours and giving me a little more space during the day. But of course, there was a catch. It would only work if I showed them more respect and followed some of their other guidelines. It felt like another power play, a way to keep me on a leash. That night, I turned to Reddit, hoping for some advice. I laid out everything that had been happening, from the curfew to the Wi-Fi surveillance, to the blowout over my hidden account. The response was overwhelming. Most people told me to leave as soon as possible, even if it meant dipping into my savings to rent a place temporarily. A few shared similar stories about overbearing parents, and their comments helped me feel less alone. But there were still doubts in my mind. On one hand, I knew that staying with my parents was wrecking my mental health, and their constant oversight was killing my productivity. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the financial advantage. Staying meant I could save up for a down payment, even if it meant dealing with all the headaches that came with living under their roof. It felt like every day I was stuck between two choices, neither of which seemed like the right one. For now, I'm still here, but I'm playing my cards close to my chest. I haven't told my parents about my next steps, and I'm trying to keep my head down while building up my savings. But deep down, I know that this living situation can't last much longer. If something doesn't change soon, I'll have to make a move, even if it means giving up my dream of owning a house for a while. For now, all I can do is hope things don't get worse. But if the past few weeks are any indication, I won't be holding my breath. Update 2. After reading all the comments on my last post, I decided to try a new approach, something that would shift the balance a little. People suggested that I stop engaging with my parents altogether to create some space and maybe force them to back off. So I went with the silent treatment strategy. Instead of arguing or trying to reason with them, I just started keeping my distance. I stopped sharing my plans or talking about my day. I kept to my room, avoided common areas, and kept my responses to a minimum when they tried to chat. It didn't take long for my parents to notice the change. They seemed confused at first, wondering why I wasn't sitting down for meals or joining in for TV time like before. They'd knock on my door, trying to invite me to dinner or to play a game, but I'd make up excuses about needing to work or being too tired. It wasn't long before the tension started building up. Meals became awkward whenever I did join them, with barely any conversation. And those game nights that used to be a weekly thing, they stopped entirely. The guilt trips came next. My parents would corner me in the hallway or the kitchen, talking about how my behavior was tearing the family apart. They'd remind me how excited they were when I first moved back and how they thought it would be a chance to reconnect. But I stuck to my plan, keeping interactions short and not giving in. I could see it bothered them, but I needed that space to breathe. Around the same time, I secretly started looking for a new job. My current role was remote, but the pay wasn't great, and if I wanted to move out sooner rather than later, I needed more money coming in. I kept this to myself, applying to higher paying positions that still allowed me to work from home. After a couple of interviews, one finally came through, a job offer with a much better salary. It felt like a lifeline. I accepted it right away. knowing this could be my ticket out. But life had other plans. Just when I thought things were looking up, my car broke down. It was an old car, and I guess it was only a matter of time before it gave out, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I had to dip into my savings for the repairs, which set me back on my goal of moving out. The money I had hoped to use for a security deposit and first month's rent was now going into a new alternator and a bunch of other fixes. The car trouble also put me in a bind with my parents. Without a working car, I couldn't make excuses about going out to co-working spaces or meeting up with friends. I was stuck at home more often, and the tension with my parents was at an all-time high. They started asking if everything was okay, wondering if I was feeling depressed. They even brought up the idea of therapy, suggesting that I should talk to someone about whatever was bothering me. It was hard to tell if they were genuinely concerned or just looking for a way to keep tabs on me. Eventually, they made me an offer. They'd pay for therapy, but only if I agreed to stay living with them for another year. They pitched it as a way for me to work through my issues and save more money, but it felt more like another way to control me. I knew they were trying to pressure me, but at the same time, the idea of therapy didn't seem all bad, especially after everything that had been going on. The stress of it all finally caught up to me one night. I had a bit of a breakdown, something I'd been holding back for weeks. I ended up calling my older sibling, who lives out of state, and just unloaded everything. I told them about the constant arguments, the curfew, the spying on my internet, and how I felt like I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. They listened, offering emotional support, but they couldn't help financially. Still, it felt good to finally get it all out to someone who understood. I went back to Reddit, updating everyone on what was happening. This time, the advice leaned heavily towards taking up the therapy offer, but with a twist. People suggested using the sessions to establish firmer boundaries with my parents, to use it as a way to stand up for myself. It made sense, so I decided to give it a try, even if it meant staying a bit longer. I started therapy a couple of weeks after that. It felt weird at first, talking about my family dynamics to a stranger, but it was a relief to have someone outside the situation to listen. The therapist didn't have any magic solutions, but they did help me see how I could set clearer boundaries. They emphasized that if I wanted any real change, I'd need to be direct and firm with my parents about what I would and wouldn't accept. So that's where I'm at now, trying to plan my next move while keeping things under wraps. I've managed to save a little more since the car repair, but I'm nowhere near where I wanted to be. My parents think the therapy is helping me become more understanding of their perspective, but in reality, it's giving me the tools I need to leave. I've got a secret countdown running in my head, aiming to be out in the next 3 months, even if it means finding a cheap, short-term rental just to get my foot out the door. The tension at home hasn't gotten any better, but I'm determined to keep my plan a secret this time. I've learned from my mistakes, and I'm being extra careful with my finances and communications. My parents are still trying to bring me back into the fold, but I'm keeping my distance, knowing that the clock is ticking down on my time under their roof. If all goes well, I'll be posting my next update from a place of my own, far away from all the drama. Let's hope I can pull it off. Update 3. With the new job in place, my focus shifted entirely to saving as much as possible. The pay bump helped a lot, and I got serious about cutting out unnecessary expenses. No more coffee shop runs unless I absolutely had to escape the house for work. And I kept my meals simple to save money. I opened a separate bank account just for my savings, no digital access that my parents could stumble upon, just a simple savings account that I hoped would grow fast enough to get me out of this situation. I thought I was being subtle, but my parents started noticing my frequent absences. Between therapy sessions, late-night work from co-working spots, and occasional meetups with friends, I wasn't home as much as I used to be. They grew suspicious, dropping comments about how I seemed to be hiding something or how they never knew where I was anymore. I kept playing it off, saying it was just work keeping me busy, but I could tell they didn't buy it. One Friday, they threw me a curveball. My parents announced they'd planned a surprise family trip for the weekend. They wanted us to reconnect and thought getting out of the house would help. The timing couldn't have been worse. I had already made plans to meet up with a friend who was going to help me scout some cheap apartment listings. But with the trip sprung on me last minute, I didn't have much choice. They insisted we leave right away, packing up the car while I scrambled to cancel my plans. On the way out, I realized something. My car keys weren't in my pocket. My dad had taken them, saying it was to make sure I wouldn't feel the need to drive back early on my own. I didn't even know what to say to that. It was clear they weren't giving me any room to leave before they were ready. It was a small thing, but it felt like a total loss of control. That realization hit me hard, and I couldn't hold back my frustration any longer. When we got to the cabin they'd booked, I couldn't take it anymore. Everything spilled out in a moment of anger, how I felt trapped, how they kept treating me like a kid, how every move I made felt watched. I threw my hands up, pacing around the living room of the cabin while my parents just stared. I could see the shock on their faces. They weren't used to seeing me this upset. It wasn't my finest moment, but I had reached my breaking point. The next day, the mood had shifted. My parents seemed nervous around me, like they didn't know how to handle what had happened. The rest of the trip was weirdly quiet. They didn't push me to join in on hikes or card games. When we got back home, they started giving me more space, almost like they were afraid I'd blow up again. It wasn't an apology, but I took it as a temporary win. Back on Reddit, I updated everyone about the meltdown during the trip. The comments poured in with people warning me that this peace offering was probably just temporary. They urged me to stick to my escape plan, not to get comfortable with this small reprieve. I knew they were right. I kept my head down, focusing on work and building up my savings. The new job came with more responsibilities, and the pressure was high, but I put up with it knowing it was my ticket to freedom. But life at home didn't stay peaceful for long. One afternoon, I came back from a therapy session to find my dad in my room, holding a small bag of cash I'd stashed in my closet. I had started keeping a little emergency cash hidden away, just in case. My dad looked at me with this mix of disappointment and anger, asking why I was hiding money again. I tried to keep calm, explaining it was just some extra savings, but the damage was done. It led to yet another confrontation. My parents accused me of being secretive, acting like I had something to hide. They claimed they were worried about my suspicious behavior, insisting that if I had nothing to hide, I should be open with them. I realized right then that no matter how much I tried to explain myself, they would always see me as the child they could keep an eye on. That realization hit hard, but instead of arguing back, I just nodded and said I'd keep things more transparent from now on. What they didn't know was that I'd already made arrangements with a friend to crash at their place for a week. I needed to clear my head and figure out my next steps. I packed a small bag and left without telling my parents it was anything more than a few days away. Once I got to my friend's place, the relief was immediate. No constant questions, no Wi-Fi restrictions, just some much-needed space. During that week, my phone blew up with calls and texts from my parents. They kept asking when I was coming back, saying they were worried and didn't understand why I needed this time away. I didn't respond right away, needing a break from the constant back and forth. My friend was understanding, but they couldn't host me forever. Their space was tight, and they had their own things to deal with. By the end of the week, I knew I had to go back, but I had a plan. I wouldn't tell them about my job offer or the separate savings account. I'd play it cool, act like things were back to normal, and keep my real plans hidden until the very last moment. If I could keep up the act for a few more weeks, I might finally be able to pack up and leave without the drama of another blowout. Going back home wasn't easy, but I kept my head down and stayed focused. I told them I just needed some time to myself and they seemed to accept it, at least on the surface. But I could see the way they kept watching me, like they knew something was up. It didn't matter though. My escape plan was still on track, and I wasn't going to let anything derail it again. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, but with each passing day, the end feels closer. I'm just hoping I can pull this off without any more surprises. Update 4. After weeks of secretly saving and planning, I finally caught a break. A one-bedroom apartment opened up nearby with a short-term lease. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean, affordable, and most importantly, it was mine. The landlord seemed chill about my situation, and after a quick walk through, I signed the contract. I kept this quiet, not wanting to risk my parents finding out before I was ready to move. I had learned my lesson from the last time. With the lease signed, I started packing slowly. I'd box up things when my parents were out or late at night when I knew they were asleep. I stashed the boxes in the garage, hidden behind some old furniture and seasonal decorations. My plan was to move out while they were visiting family for a weekend. It seemed like the perfect time. No drama, no confrontation, just a clean break. As the weekend got closer, my parents started asking more questions. They noticed I wasn't around the house as much, and they'd catch me glancing at my packed bags a little too often. They'd drop hints, asking if I was planning any big changes soon, or if I had something going on. I kept my answers vague, saying work was busy and I was focusing on getting things done. It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The day finally came. My parents packed up their car for the weekend trip, making a big deal about how they were looking forward to some time away. As soon as they left, I got to work. I pulled out the boxes from the garage, loading them into my car as quickly as I could. It felt like some kind of high-stakes heist. I'd just finished packing the last few things when I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside. My heart sank. My parents were back, 2 hours earlier than they were supposed to be. I froze for a moment, hoping they wouldn't notice what was happening, but it didn't take long for them to put two and two together. They walked into the garage, seeing the half-empty shelves and the boxes packed tightly in my trunk. The confusion on their faces quickly turned to anger. What followed was a massive argument that spilled out into the driveway. My parents were furious, accusing me of betrayal and hiding things from them. They kept asking why I hadn't told them about my plan, why I felt the need to sneak around like a thief. I tried to explain that I needed my own space, that living under their rules wasn't working for me anymore, but every explanation only seemed to make them angrier. My dad accused me of throwing away our family bond for a place of my own, while my mom begged me to reconsider, reminding me that family should stick together. The back and forth dragged on for what felt like hours. Neighbors peeked out their windows, probably wondering what all the noise was about, but I didn't care. This was my chance to stand my ground, and I wasn't backing down this time. For the first time, I didn't give in. I stayed firm, telling them that this was something I had to do for myself. My parents tried everything, reasoning guilt-tripping, even a few tears, but I kept loading boxes into the car, one after another. It wasn't easy, but I kept reminding myself of all the nights I spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever feel like an adult in my own home again. Eventually, they realized they couldn't change my mind. My mom broke down, and my dad just stood there, shaking his head. They kept saying I was making a mistake, that I'd regret leaving like this. But I couldn't let that stop me. I loaded the last box, closed the trunk, and climbed into the driver's seat. My parents stood in the driveway, watching as I pulled out onto the street. The drive to my new place was quiet. No music, no calls, just the hum of the car engine, and the realization that I had finally done it. I had broken free. When I got to the apartment, I felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. I dragged my stuff inside, one box at a time, until the last of my things were in my new space. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I could breathe again. The first few days in the new apartment were surreal. I could work late without worrying about the Wi-Fi cutting out. I could cook what I wanted, decorate how I liked, and spend time alone without someone knocking on my door. It felt like a different world, one where I had control over my own life again. But as expected, the fallout with my parents wasn't over. They went radio silent for days, ignoring my texts and calls. It was clear they were hurt by how things ended, and part of me knew this wasn't the last I'd hear from them. Eventually, my sibling reached out. They offered to come by and help me set up my new place. It wasn't much, but having them around made the transition easier. We talked about everything that had happened, and it was nice to have at least one family member in my corner. I shared another update on Reddit, telling everyone how things had finally played out. The support was overwhelming. People praised me for finally taking control, for standing up to my parents, and for making the leap to independence. A few shared their own stories, telling me how they'd gone through similar struggles with overbearing parents. It felt good to know that I wasn't alone. Now I'm focusing on adjusting to this new chapter. I've got a lot of work to do, getting used to paying rent again, balancing bills, and figuring out this whole adulting thing. But even with all the challenges, I wouldn't trade this freedom for anything. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living on my own terms. My parents might not understand it yet, but I'm hoping that in time they'll see why I had to do this. Until then, I'm just taking it one day at a time, figuring out what life looks like without someone constantly watching over my shoulder. It's not perfect, but it's a start, and for now, that's enough. Update 5. Life without my parents' constant oversight felt like a breath of fresh air. I finally had control over my time and my space. The first few weeks in my new apartment were challenging. I had to get used to handling all the bills, managing rent, and remembering little things like buying toilet paper before I ran out. But that sense of independence made it all worth it. It was the little things like choosing my own groceries and having a quiet space to focus on work that reminded me why I made this move. Adjusting to the financial side of living alone wasn't easy. With the new job, my salary was better, but I had to be careful about how I spent. I learned quickly that expenses pile up fast: electricity, internet, unexpected repairs. There were a few times when I caught myself stressing over the numbers, but it felt different from the anxiety I'd had living at home. This was stress that came with freedom, and that made it easier to handle. After about a month of radio silence from my parents, I received an email from them. It was long and carefully worded, and it was clear they had spent a lot of time thinking about what to say. They wrote about how hurt they were by how things ended, how they felt blindsided by my decision to leave. But they also said that they wanted to find a way to fix things, to have a relationship with me even if I wasn't living under their roof. I thought about it for a few days, talked it over with my therapist, and eventually decided to meet up with them. It felt strange, sitting down in a neutral space, a small cafe a few blocks from my new place, to talk through everything that had gone wrong. My therapist had helped me understand that a lot of their behavior came from fear of losing control, a struggle with the fact that their youngest kid was now an adult. It didn't make what they did right, but it helped me frame the conversation. During that meeting, I laid everything out. I explained how the rules and constant monitoring made me feel like I was suffocating. I told them that if we were going to have a relationship, things needed to change. I needed my space, my privacy, and the freedom to live my life without feeling like they were watching my every move. They listened, and to my surprise, they apologized. They admitted that they had struggled with letting go and that they didn't realize how much they were holding on until it pushed me away. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were awkward silences, moments where I could see my mom fighting back tears, but it felt like a step in the right direction. We agreed to take things slow, occasional visits, a few phone calls here and there. It wasn't like before, but that was the point. I needed the distance, and they seemed to understand that this time. In the meantime, my job started to pick up. I was hitting my deadlines again, getting positive feedback from my manager, and for the first time in months, I could see a future where I wasn't constantly worrying about work. With the new stability, I managed to put away a little bit more into my savings each month. It wasn't a huge amount, but I was back on track toward my goal of buying a place someday, a goal that seemed impossible just a few months ago. And while I was rebuilding things with my parents, I also started dipping my toes back into dating. It felt good to meet new people without having to worry about introducing them to my parents right away or explaining why I was sneaking around. One person in particular stood out, and after a few dates, I felt ready to bring them into my world a little more. When the time came, I introduced them to my parents, and while it was awkward, my parents definitely overcompensated with politeness. They respected my boundaries and didn't try to push too much. We've settled into a new routine now. Instead of those dreaded game nights and mandatory dinners, I suggested monthly brunches. It's a way to stay connected without feeling like I'm being pulled back into old dynamics. The first few were tense, but over time it's become something we can actually enjoy. They've backed off, and I think they're starting to see that giving me space doesn't mean losing me altogether. Sharing this final update with Reddit felt like closing a chapter. The support I've received from everyone here has meant more than I can say. Seeing strangers on the internet take the time to offer advice, share their own stories, and encourage me to take control of my life has made all the difference. It's been a long road, but I'm finally in a place where I feel like I'm moving forward instead of being stuck. This whole experience has taught me a lot about myself, and about my parents too. It's not always easy to stand up to the people who raised you, especially when they're doing what they think is right. But sometimes you have to draw those lines for your own well-being. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can handle more than I gave myself credit for. Life isn't perfect now, and I still have moments where I doubt my choices, but I'm proud of the progress I've made, I'm proud of the boundaries I've set and the independence I've fought for. And most importantly, I'm proud that I didn't give up, even when things felt impossible. If you're reading this and you're in a similar situation, just know that it's okay to put yourself first, even when it's hard. Here's to whatever comes next, both the challenges and the victories. And if my parents are reading this, though I really hope they're not, I just want them to know that I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. And I think in time, they'll see that this was the best thing for all of us.